We had the duck character because Walt had seen or heard Clarence Nash. So we had the duck, and we knew we were going to use his voice. What he looked like, I had no idea. And Albert Herder drew the duck, and he put a sailor suit on him. Albert really created the concept. It may have developed and changed as time went by, but Albert put Donald in the role of where a duck should be. On the water. Sailor. Those things are so small, but someone thinks of that, and does that, and that becomes important. Without that, I don't know what he would have been. Herder's influence on his fellow Disney artists went beyond the character design or his thousands of inspirational sketches. He also introduced his colleagues to some of the masters, from the early Dutch painters to the German illustrators Hermann Vogel and Heinrich Kley, who fascinated Walt and his team. In the early 1930s, the studio even brought 4 books by Vogel from Herder. Disney artist and caricaturist Thornton Hee, who is always credited as T. still remembered years later how Herder introduced him to the art of French caricaturist Sem. Albert brought a book to the studio library one day, and when I went into the library to get something, here were 4 or 5 of the members of Joe Grant's story department and some of the other departments, and they were looking at this book of caricatures by Sem. It was a huge book, maybe 24 inches wide by 28 or 29 inches high. I had seen some of these caricatures in magazines that a neighbor had. She was considered kind of sophisticated because she subscribed to La Vie Parisienne magazine, a French magazine that had a lot of semi-unclad young ladies in it. But Sem's caricatures were of the people of that day, and I was intrigued by his drawings. I said, "My goodness, that's French caricaturist Sem." He said, "Yes, I picked this up in a second-hand bookstore. I bought it not for me, but for someone else." Several of the other boys said, "How much did you pay for it?" He said, "It doesn't make any difference how much I paid for it." "Well, look, I'd like to buy it. Would you take $25 or $25 or $30? One fellow said he'd give $50 for it. He said, "No, that book is for T. He is the caricaturist." And he gave me the book. I still have it. I wonder if his children have it, since he passed away some time back. Oh, and here's Herder's assistant, Bob Kuwahara. Walt, who did not miss anything that happened in his studio, knew of Albert's skills as a caricaturist, and when in January of 1936 he started toying with the idea of establishing a caricature class led by story artist Joe Grant, he immediately thought of Herder as one of the potential teachers. Such men as Campbell Grant, Ward Kimball, Albert Herder could be a big help to the class, to just informally discuss with the others the things they know about caricaturing. A brilliant and lovable man. Herder was a man of surprising habits, as his Barry Bowers colleagues had realized many years earlier. Things did not change at Disney. According to fellow Disney artist Jack Kinney, his routine was set in stone. Albert always got to the studio at 6:30 a.m. to walk around the parking lot adjacent to our apartment houses, smoke his cigar, and read all the papers. Until 8 a.m., when well informed, he was ready to work. Sometimes he was more informed than he realized. Ted Sears often brought him the papers, and Ted was an expert at meticulously doctoring the headlines to make them more sensational than intended. He'd take the most innocuous day and turn it into a disastrous one. Albert never discovered Ted's ploy, but he would always explode at the startling news. "Mein Gott! Would you look what that crazy Hitler is doing now?" Albert was a loner. He never married, and would work no other way. He insisted on living in a hotel at 4th and Main, a shady neighborhood, and the same place where Albert resided while working for Van Nostrand. There he could observe a great many offbeat characters and things, and his pencil would recreate them in far-out drawings of every kind imaginable. At noon, Albert would emerge to walk around the studio, smoke his cigar, and stop to talk on any subject. As he walked, we noticed he had a tendency to limp slightly. One day I asked him about his feet. Did they hurt? Were his shoes too tight? No, said Albert. My shoes. That's where I carry my cash. I do not trust some of the neighborhood people around 4th and Main Streets. Well, that was a simple answer from a complicated man. Bill Cottrell recalled another of his quirks, which was a great help to him in his work. Albert was unusually brilliant. He had a marvelous background in art. He loved to draw, loved museums, and loved all the artwork he'd ever seen. The things that he liked, he remembered everything. He was a great man to work with. If he wanted the uniform of a Swiss guard, he could draw it. He would say, "That has 6 buttons on it. I remember, I saw it in a museum in Zurich." You know, he remembered everything. This stunning photographic memory was confirmed by another of Herder's colleagues at the time, puppeteer Bob Jones. I was working up some mechanical drawings. He looked at me and said, "Hey, that joint, I remember that 1913 tractor. It was a U.S. Caterpillar." I looked at him sort of strange. He said, "That joint, the way they had it," and he started. He made this very interesting 3-dimensional sketch of this joint. He said, "This is what they used." I said, "Albert, what about the 1912 tractor?" He said, "I don't know anything about that." I said, "Okay, what about the 1914? And he said, "I don't know anything about that either." I said, "Okay, how did you know about the 1913? He said, "I read a brochure on it once. Talk about a photographic mind." From concept to art direction. Oh, and here's Albert Herder working on Pinocchio. Walt, from concept art to art direction. Walt deeply valued Albert's talent, and when the studio started work on the first 2 feature-length pictures, Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs and Pinocchio, Herder was instrumental in establishing the European look and feel of both movies. In 1936, director David Hand had told a group of layout artists, "Albert is to be the supervisor of keeping the picture Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, the interior of the dwarf's house, and all exteriors. Woods, sunlight, dark moonlight shots. Albert is to watch that closely. For that reason, mainly it would be necessary for each layout man to work with Albert. Tom Kodrick, who is handling the interior of the dwarf's house, and Terrell Stapp will work together, but pass through Albert so that we have the correct character of the dwarf's house. So it is with the exteriors. Mac Stewart and Charles Payzant, it will be through contact with Albert we will get the character we are after." Background artist Claude Coates recalled many years later, "Albert Herder was the one who really started off on Snow White, with carving things in there and the backs of chairs and little animals, and his drawings were what was incorporated into Snow White. During the period before Pinocchio, he did an awful lot of little jugs that had funny faces on them, and handles and funny feet, and all kinds of ways of humanizing inanimate objects. He did an awful lot of styling on the clocks and the music boxes, and all the little things that came in and out. Just the general character of things. Probably the style of the architecture, or the carving on the little hand that Cleo's fishbowl was standing on." Herder's influence on the look and feel of Snow White and Pinocchio was absolutely critical. But even at this stage of his Disney career, his main contribution came under the guise of inspirational sketches. He was, more than anything else, the spark that kept others inspired. The way Walt used Albert Herder was to turn him loose on a project, to give him his head over a situation or story, to see what he could come up with, explained Dick Humer. Albert would sit by himself all day and fill sheet after sheet with drawings, all highly imaginative and often startlingly grotesque. Once turned loose, Albert produced so much, and his artistic range was so broad that even Walt seemed at times a little overwhelmed. In an early story meeting discussing Alice in Wonderland in December of 1938, Walt exclaimed about one of the sequences, "This is a marvelous chance for us to use a lot of screwy stuff of Albert's that he does back there that we can't find any place for in any picture because it's too screwy." A last bow on stage. By the late 1930s, Herder was involved in every single animated feature that Walt was considering, creating inspirational sketches for Fantasia, The Reluctant Dragon, and Dumbo, as well as for many features that would only be released after World War II, well after he passed away. These included The Wind in the Willows, a sequence that was integrated in The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, Cinderella, Peter Pan, Johnny Fedora and Alice Bluebonnet, a sequence of Make My Music, Bongo, a sequence of Fun and Fancy Free, and even Lady and the Tramp. In the latter half of 1940, Albert moved from his quarters in Los Angeles to a stone lodge in the San Fernando Valley on Ventura Boulevard, which he intended to furnish as a combined studio and library to quietly pursue his hobbies. But his health failed him before these plans were completed. In October of that year, the 57-year-old Herder was rushed to the Hollywood Hospital and was diagnosed as suffering from pulmonary edema, a health issue often caused by congestive heart failure. By the end of November, his health seemed to be improving, and he was moved to a convalescent home, the Cedar Lodge Sanitarium. Through the whole ordeal, he kept drawing. On February 19th, 1941, Joe Grant wrote to Walt, "Albert is working on the flea circus in Fido Bones, a project that was later abandoned." Joe also sent a note of promise to Herder through studio nurse Hazel George, who reported, "Last night I took your PS to Albert. He blushed with the joy and relief it brought and said, 'Now I can really work. This is what I have been waiting for. I was so afraid I had lost it. So Joe thinks it's all right. He wants me to tell you not to be afraid of overworking him or of putting him under pressure, because he knows now how to conserve and use his ebb and flow of energy. I have learned to live with it," he said, indicating his heart. The following month, Herder told Hazel, "You bring the work, I go crazy if I don't work." In May, Disney's accountant at the time, O.B. Johnson, a good friend of Herder's, informed members of his family, who lived abroad, of the grim